Good morning, everybody. Welcome back from spring break. I hope everybody had a relaxing week away from our new online education. I hope everybody is healthy. I hope everybody is safe. And I hope everybody is ready to start our distance learning opportunities that we've got here through Google Classroom and through Google. Today we're going to start with 8.2, which is going to be looking at the nationalist movements in Africa and the Middle East as well. We basically have three parts to it. We've got African nationalism. We've then got the Negritude movement, which is the response to some of the African nationalism that we see. So two different kinds of African nationalism, as well as then Middle Eastern nationalism. So we're actually going to start here with the country of South Africa. Now, hopefully most of you will remember from several weeks ago when we last did South Africa, we were looking at the British Empire taking it over from the Dutch, or from the Boers. And if you remember, the Boers were those Dutch farmers in South Africa who moved up to the High Veld to try to get away from the British, which worked okay until, of course, the British discovered gold and diamonds in the High Veld. And then, of course, that led to the conflict that we call the Boer War, which eventually will lead us to the point where the British start using concentration camps and putting people into those. And when the Boer guerrillas blow up the railroad lines, then it leads to starvation. And hopefully you guys remember the photographs that I showed you of all of that from the last time that we did South Africa. Now, after the First World War, one of the things that we see in South Africa specifically is that the Boers and the British actually decide that they're going to unite together as white South Africans, and they're going to put themselves in a position of power where they're going to create a special class system, which is called apartheid. And apartheid basically is a South African word that means separateness. And what they start to think about is the old adage of birds of a feather should flock together. So they say, listen, we're Boers and we're British, and so we should really be together and we should really have kind of the same situation. But it's everybody else really that ultimately is different than us, and so we should put them into separate categories. And so they started to create this apartheid system, really during and following World War I, in which they create a class system in South Africa based exclusively on race. And so there are four different categories of people living in South Africa at the time. You've got the white race group, which of course is going to have all of the power. They're going to have all of the privileges. They're going to have the education system. They're going to have a good healthcare system. They're going to have, every advantage you can have. The white race group is going to have that. Beyond that, we've got the black race group. This would be categorized for Native African people, black African people. They're, of course, going to have very few privileges and basically no privileges. They're going to be taken advantage of. They're going to be, pushed to the margins and ultimately disadvantaged within society. Beyond that, we also have what's called the colored race group. Generally, the colored race group is going to be for people who are of mixed heritage, and they're going to be kind of somewhere in the middle. They are better off generally in society than the black race group, but they're definitely not as well off as the white race group. And then the final category, the fourth category in the apartheid system, was called the Indians. And Indian people, of course, are there because it's a British colony, and so we're talking about people from India. And basically, they're going to have to fight their way to having somewhat more rights than the black or the colored race group, but the Indians are the fourth racial category. Now, one of the things that starts to happen then is in 1948, we get a new prime minister whose name was Daniel Francois Malan, and that's who we're looking at right here, who really starts the institutionalization of apartheid. He really starts making it the legal system of South Africa. And what we see is that signs like this start to pop up all over the place. So you can see here, this specifically says that these premises and the amenities thereof have been reserved for the exclusive use of white persons. So we're talking about public premises. We're talking about parks. We're talking about Restrooms, specifically to be used by whites only. We're talking about things like beaches even, right? So you can see here that this is from the city of Durban, and it says that under Section 37 of the Durban Beach Bylaws, this bathing area is reserved for the sole use of members of the white race group. This particular photograph, you'll notice, doesn't look like it's that old because this one's actually from the 1980s. The apartheid system was created during and after World War I. It was formalized in 1948, and then it really continued all the way up into the 1990s. It really wasn't going to be taken apart until the early 1990s, right? And we can see that, you know, throughout society, this racial system of segregation and separation is no joke. And this is a sign that was put up by a white farmer, and he definitely isn't joking about this. He definitely means this, right? So if you'll notice here, he's coming out and saying, you know, members of the natives and Indian and colored race group, if you're on my farm at night, you know, something bad's going to happen to you, right? You're going to be listed as missing. Armed guards are going to shoot you on sight, and our dogs are going to eat your bodies. No one's ever going to find you again. You've been warned. And of course, you can imagine that if this were to actually happen, that because the person is a member of the white race group, that they're probably not going to suffer any consequences as a result of it either. Next, of course, we see that, you know, what are the actual consequences here of apartheid for people who are living in South Africa? So we can see just specifically a comparison from around 1978 between the black race group and the white race group, right? So we can see the population difference, of course. There's almost 20 million black people. There's about 4.5 million white people, right? So whites are the numerical minority, but they are the political power majority. We can see that from things like the land allocation. 87% of the land is owned by whites, 13% is owned by blacks. When we look at the share of the national income, members of the white race group take in 75% of the wealth, versus less than 20% going to the black race group. When we look at that as a ratio, whites earn 14 times more than blacks do under the apartheid system. Right? When we see what is the minimum taxable income, it's basically double between blacks and whites, right? When you look at doctors per population, so if you are a black person in the apartheid system, there's one doctor for every 44,000 of you versus one doctor for every 400 of you in the white race group, right? So imagine that impact on your daily life. Imagine that impact on something like if you're living through, I don't know, a global pandemic, right? That's going to have a major impact on your life. And that's not a small impact either, right? When we look at infant mortality rate, of course, whites have a very, you know, reasonable for the 20th century, 2.7%. Now, even that's, you know, pretty darn high for a relatively developed country. But when we look at that compared to the black race group, right, 20% living in cities and 40% of all infants are going to die before their 5th birthday in the countryside. Right? If you look at spending, the category of spending per pupil, $45 a year for a black student versus $700 per year for a white student, right? And in the teacher to student ratio, right, you've got a 1 to 60. One teacher for every 60 black students versus one teacher for every 22 white students. So the disparity here is not a small thing. It's a major problem. It's a major issue. It's a major system to take advantage of the native people. And it goes even further after this. Eventually they start to realize that black people aren't really all that happy with the apartheid system, and they try to come up with a reason why that is. And they say, well, the reason why the black people aren't really all that happy is that they're living in cities, they're taking, you know, they're using jobs that white people are doing. They're not living according to the way that black people are supposed to live, of course, and that's in air quotes. And so what we have to do is we have to make them more comfortable by putting them out where they're going to feel more comfortable. And so what they do is they create a system called Bantustans, which is Bantustans, Bantustans. And so they create these Bantustans and they force black people to live in them. And essentially what they become is slums. Right? These are places with very high population densities, very high populations, very low advantages, not a whole lot of infrastructure, not a whole lot of positive things going on in here. Black people basically lose their right to own land, and they're forced to live out in these kind of undesirable parts of the country, and they lose their political rights, they lose their economic rights, and they're basically made second-class citizens. Now, in response to this, one of the things we see is The black folks, and of course South Africa is an example of this. We do see this in other colonies in Africa. We see a movement which is called Pan-Africanism. And Pan-Africanism is this idea that black people should really unite together and African people should really unite together, see themselves as having commonality, see themselves as all fighting in part of the same struggle, and see themselves as really, being a member of a larger kind of African nation. And so really it becomes an African nationalist movement. They start to develop symbols, they start to develop political power, or at least they're trying to advocate for their own political power. And from this, we also see a cultural movement, very similar to what we saw in Latin America with the cultural nationalism movement. We see basically the same thing in Africa, except we call this the Negritude movement. The Negritude movement, by and large, is revolving around this kind of pro-African, pro-black African nationalist movement. They start to develop Negritude art and painting, and so we see a celebration of Africanness. They start to celebrate their own cultural values. They start to express those cultural values in artistic movements. They start to develop African styles of dress. This Negritude movement really starts in Africa, and then it really does spread around the world. So here we can see, African American people who adopt a hairstyle called the Afro, which is basically that we're gonna, black people decide we're gonna stop trying to, appear to be white people. We're not gonna straighten our hair anymore. We're just gonna kind of let it do what it naturally does. And we're going to be proud of that. And we're going to embrace that. And we're going to, promote this idea that black is beautiful and being African is a good thing, and we're proud of this heritage. And so that's really the response, right? And that's really the second big piece to this section is we see the kind of taking advantage of black people from white Africans, and then we see the response, which is this Pan-Africanism and this Negritude movement, which starts to push for African rights and black rights and things like that. The final piece for Chapter 8, Section 2 is nationalism going on in the Middle East. And so the first place we start is in Turkey. This is Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, who we've talked about before. He was a leader of the Young Turks movement who was trying to push for a modernization and secularization of the country of Turkey, which used to be the ruling country of the Ottoman Empire. Now you remember that they're part of the Central Powers during the First World War. At the end of World War I, one of the things that happens to this vast Ottoman Empire is it gets split up and broken up into several different pieces, and one of those pieces becomes the British Mandate of Palestine, which you see here on the left, and the British Mandate of Transjordan. Both of those mandates were basically control over those areas given to the British Empire to control until the British Empire thought that the people in Palestine and the people in Transjordan would be able to handle themselves to run their own countries. That's going to happen really in the early 1920s. In 1923, the British Mandate for Palestine is going to become an independent country called Palestine. Now, people have been living in Palestine, and of course, we talked about them a little bit before. People in Palestine are ethnically, they are Arab people, right? They come from the Middle East, and culturally and religiously, they are Muslim people. However, if you also remember, looking back a little ways after the Dreyfus Affair in France, one of the consequences of that was the development of Zionism, or Jewish nationalism. After the Dreyfus Affair, Theodore Herzl really starts to believe that hey, Jews aren't going to get treated fairly anyplace else. We really want a homeland of our own. And some Zionists start to promote the idea of maybe we should go back to our traditional homeland in the old country of Israel, which of course doesn't exist anymore. But the old country of Israel also matches up with the new country of Palestine. And so following World War I, one of the things we see is that small numbers of Jews start to move there, and Generally, the people who move there are relatively wealthy. They go and they start businesses and they hire Palestinian people and they found settlements and communities for Jewish people to live in. And it generally starts off as a relatively good thing between the Palestinians, who are happy to have the flow of cash into their country getting higher, and the Jews, who are starting to have Jewish settlements of their own. And Jews are coming from all over the world to Palestine to live and work together and to start forging this kind of national identity. The problem, of course, is they're doing this within someone else's country, and so eventually when the inflow of Jewish people starts to get larger and larger and larger following World War I, it's going to lead to some tension, and it's going to lead to the Palestinian people feeling like, hey, wait a minute, this used to be a good thing, but now we feel like we're losing our country. So that's where we're going to leave this off today for Chapter 8, Section 2. I hope everybody's going to, get back into the swing of things. I hope that you're going to do well, with this kind of weekly schedule that I've developed. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to drop a comment to me in my email. Or you can also, of course, leave comments on Google Classroom, and you're also free to leave them on the bottom of this video. So I will see you guys in the next video when we start looking at Indian nationalism. Of course, that one's the last one that you're going to do for this first week back from spring break. Everybody, I hope you stay healthy. I hope you stay safe, and I will see you in the next video.